Well, good afternoon. Go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Wilson Center. It's nice to see the faces of lots of old friends here. Since this is being webcast, I'm going to say just a word about the Wilson Center, even though all of you in the room will know already what I'm going to say. But also, since it's webcast, I would ask you if you would turn off all your electronic devices because it plays havoc with the webcast. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the nation's memorial to President Wilson, who, prior to entering politics, was a distinguished political scientist and student of government. The center was created by an act of Congress 41 years ago and commemorates Woodrow Wilson's twin interests in sound public policy and sound scholarship. That's what we try to do here, and I am sure that by the time you leave here a little bit later in the day, you'll be convinced that our current guest scholar certainly combines those two of Wilson's interests in scholarship and public policy. This event is co-sponsored by the Kissinger Institute for China and the United States, ably led by Stapleton Roy in the back of the room. We're delighted to partner with Kissinger. Our speaker today is Rick Smith, or more formally, Richard C. Smith. Rick is the current Woodrow Wilson Center Australian scholar. He has been with us throughout the spring and, alas, threatens to leave us a couple of weeks from now. He is working on a research project exploring Australia's response to the rise of China. Rick Smith has had an extraordinarily distinguished career in public service of his country. Among his many senior positions, he served for 4 years as Australia's ambassador to China. He was also ambassador to Indonesia. And for a period of almost 4 years, he was Secretary of the Department of Defense, which is the senior-most civil service position in the Defense Department. He retired at the end of 2006, so he thought. No sooner had he retired than the Prime Minister recruited him to lead a review of Australia's homeland and border security arrangements. That was good for Australia. It was bad for us because we had appointed him here, and he had to postpone his arrival here by a year. But we were successful in getting him here earlier this spring. The Prime Minister, however, once again realized a good thing when he had him, and shortly after Rick's arrival here, the Prime Minister appointed him as Australia's special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. So Rick has been doing two hats, wearing two hats since he's been here. But I should say, I don't think any of us have enjoyed a visiting scholar, more than we've enjoyed Rick. So Rick, we're looking forward to your presentation together today, and I turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that and much else. Napoleon once said, or it's said that he said, let China sleep. When she awakes, the world will be sorry. Napoleon's choice is no longer available to us. China is awake, and having awakened, it can either succeed or it can fail. If it succeeds, as it has so far, China will challenge the existing world order, as it has. If it should fail, it will become not only an enormously self-preoccupied with the survival of its own state, but also a grumpy and resentful member of the world community, and a challenge of a different kind. The work I've been privileged to be able to do here has been premised on the first of those scenarios. It was not my purpose to consider all of the possibilities for the future of China. I will leave that as the Chinese themselves would say, to wiser heads. And anyway, a project on the second possibility, the consequences of China's failure, would be considerably more demanding than the one that the Woodrow Wilson Centre has so generously enabled me to pursue on the implications for Australia of China's continued success. So, Bob, my sincere thanks to the Wilson Centre and all of you for the opportunity to do all of that, and to all here who helped with my deliberations, either formally or informally in our many discussions over lunch and elsewhere in and around this wonderful place. There are two parts to this project. The first is an account of Australia's response to the rise of China since 1979, and an attempt to make some evaluation of just how important China has become to Australia. The second is an assessment of the implications of this for Australia's interests in the emerging post-China rise world, and an attempt to describe the policy framework needed to manage it. So the starting point for this project is 1979, when China launched its first post-Mao reinvention. Each of Australia's 5 prime ministers since then has had his own conceptual view of China. Malcolm Fraser, as a farmer who governed in a coalition with the Country or Farmers' Party, was well focused on the trade prospects which China offered even before 1979, and especially, of course, in agriculture. In strategic terms, he saw China through a prism very much like that of Nixon and Kissinger at the time, a prism, that is, through which China was seen as a counterweight in Asia to the Soviet Union. Bob Hawke, as Prime Minister from 1983 to 1991, was arguably the first Prime Minister who had an authentically Australian post-79 view of China. Though he inherited some of the Labor Party's traditional enthusiasm for the country, he was not much influenced by ideology or Labor's sympathetic history with China. He regarded China's economic growth as irreversible, and had a clear-minded appreciation of the importance of this to Australia and the region. He developed a persuasive narrative about the relationship between his government's strong domestic economic reform agenda and its relationship with Asia and China in particular. Stated roughly, as Australia ran down its inefficient, subsidised manufacturing sector and internationalised its economy, Australians would see the pain of economic reform compensated for by the growth in export markets and the availability of cheaper manufactured goods. Paul Keating, who succeeded Hawke in 1991, shared this understanding of the nexus between Australia's economic transformation and the opportunities offered by the economic growth of Asia. But he also projected an ambitious strategic agenda centred on the importance of engaging both China and the United States in regional affairs. He initiated the APEC Leaders Forum and envisaged for it a critical role in bringing China, the United States and Japan together around the one table. John Howard led the Conservative coalition into office in 1996 with a less aspirational, more prosaic view of Australia's international interests. It was his nature and political style to talk about practical outcomes rather than conceptual goals, and about bilateral rather than regional approaches. His visit to China in April 1997 was one of the events which defined the approach he took to Australia's international policies in the 11 years of his prime ministership. Howard developed a theme which involved distinguishing between friendship and interests, emphasising the latter over the former, an approach which intrigued the Chinese for some time. He was also conscious of the potential tension between Australia's relationships with the United States and China. He sought to deal with that by compartmentalising the two sets of interests and making clear that Australia did not wish and saw no need to choose between them. His defining achievement in this area was to invite Presidents Bush and Hu Jintao to address the Australian Parliament within 2 days of each other in October 2003. With Kevin Rudd's election at the head of a Labor government in 2007, Australia acquired a Prime Minister who is not only the first to have been born after World War II, but who famously speaks Mandarin and had worked in China as a diplomat in the 1980s and less well known as a business consultant in the mid-1990s. This resume has stood Rudd in good stead in many ways, but in some ways it has also proven a liability in political terms. Attempts were made during the 2007 election campaign in Australia to portray him as the Manchurian candidate, and the parliamentary opposition and media critics have been quick to highlight instances in which they claim he has been soft on China. Subsequent speculation about whether this criticism has caused Rudd to hedge his public views on China has led in turn to conjecture about what his real views are. From my own experience, I'd apply the word realistic. The story of the Australia-China relationship over these last 30 years has been a story of enormous growth and a tale about complementarity. The value of Australia's exports to China in 30 years grew 50-fold, by 28% in 2007-8 alone, making China Australia's largest trading partner overall. It now takes nearly 14% of all of Australia's exports, worth nearly 3% of GDP. It is also Australia's second largest source of imports, after the United States, of course. Natural resources account for 86% of all Australia's exports to China, and they'll grow further, especially in the energy sector, to include significant exports of LNG and uranium, the first shipment of which left for China in November 2008. But it's not only about resources. China has become Australia's second largest market for agricultural products, its fifth largest market for manufactured goods, and a very significant market for services exports. And this one is interesting. Service exports have grown by 20% annually over the last 5 years. In 2008, some 127,000 Chinese students were enrolled in Australian educational students. That amounted to some 23% of all foreign students in Australia, and Chinese students. There were more Chinese students in Australia than in any other country, we're told. As well, 356,000 Chinese tourists visited Australia in 2008. That's 6.4% of all foreign visitors, and makes China the fifth largest source of visitors to Australia. Overall, what China's growth has achieved most for Australian trade has been a dramatic change in its terms of trade. Terms of trade had turned down for Australia in the 1980s, and indeed in March 87 were worse than at any time since 1945. But over the next 21 years they doubled, primarily as a result of price changes driven by the growth of the Chinese market for raw materials. Chinese investment in Australia makes for a fascinating story, which I'll be very happy to talk about in more detail later if anyone wishes, and I hope they do. For the moment, just let me offer the bare details. At the end of 2007, approved Chinese investment in Australia added up to just $6.2 billion. That's all Australian dollars from here on. By the end of 2008, that figure had jumped to $35 billion 1 year, mainly as a result of Chinalco's first tranche of investment in Rio. A second Chinalco-Rio proposal was very recently withdrawn by Rio's board. Had it been approved, then with other approvals this year, the figure would have reached nearly $66 billion by the end of 2009. As it is, it will come in at around $42 billion. Compare that with the US investment, which is about $450 billion, EU about $130, and Japan about $60. The issue is worth noting not only for what it says about China's new global investment strategies, but also because this aspect of the economic relationship has excited more controversy than any other. Generally, with the exception of parts of the manufacturing sector, China's growth has been seen in Australia as positive and unthreatening. Export growth led in turn to a rapid growth in government revenues from royalties and taxes, which enabled governments, both federal and state, to exercise politically attractive spending choices and to pay down debt and build up reserves, which have since been critical to the Rudd government's stimulus packages. And of course, inflation and interest rates were contained, at least through to 2007, in good part because of the availability of low-priced Chinese goods which had a significant deflationary effect. As well, the Australian stock market boomed, adding to the personal wealth of many Australians, 80% of whom now own shares. This, of course, is not to say that there are not real concerns about aspects of the economic relationship with China. Issues like access to investment in China's mining sector, agricultural protection, and the protection of Australian IP remain very prominent on the bilateral agenda. Negotiations for a free trade agreement are now into their 13th round and clearly face challenges in all those areas, among others. Beyond these negotiations, while the real business is of course done by the Australian private sector, the government's role in commercial matters in China is probably greater than in almost any other country. This is not so much because the Chinese companies involved are mostly state-owned, but more because the Chinese still play the old mercantilist game, in which business prizes are linked to government policies and behaviour, and look to home governments to underwrite the performance of their companies. As to the importance of China to Australia's economy, I wouldn't argue that China has become Australia's most significant economic partner. That would be to overlook the scale and especially the depth of Australia's economic relationships with the United States, Japan, the EU and others. But there's little doubt that China's impact over the last 30 years and certainly over the last decade has been more significant than that of any other economy. Moreover, Australia's own economic reforms of the last 25 years and the essential internationalisation of its economy would not have succeeded as they have without the benefits of China's economic growth. Indeed, part of the complementarity between the Australian and Chinese economies derives from the fact that both were undergoing reform of a different kind at the same time. In short, China has made an enormous difference to Australia's recent economic fortunes, and that judgment is now embedded in Australia's political as well as economic cultures, where expectations for further growth remain high. We are, of course, in the midst of a period of negative growth for most economies. China's growth has fallen but remains positive. Australia's economy, after one quarter of negative growth, is now back in the black. If, as it seems, the global crisis has affected Australia less than any other OECD country, then this will be the result not just of timely government intervention using Chinese earned surpluses, but also because the Chinese economy has in effect put a floor under its fall. Through all of this, the political and foreign policy relationship has progressed along, navigating, of course, the usual shoals of human rights, Tibet and Taiwan. There was a hiatus after 1989 when sanctions were imposed post-Tiananmen, albeit less rigorous than those of some other countries. There was another rough patch in 1996 as the new Conservative government in Australia settled in and confronted quite suddenly a string of issues which attracted China's unhappiness. But these were worked through, each side satisfied that the other had learned some lesson or other. Along the way, creative approaches have been taken in some areas, notably human rights and the handling of Chinese illegal immigration to Australia. On the two occasions on which Australia specifically sought China's help, in relation to Cambodia in the early 90s and to East Timor, more importantly, in 99, Beijing came to the party. Especially after 1991, Australia worked hard to engage China in regional forums, a matter on which the Chinese, you might recall, were at first quite wary. On the reverse matter, Australia's membership of regional bodies and forums, China, while not actively opposed, has at times been less supportive than Australian governments might have hoped for. In the South Pacific, China-Taiwan competition was generally unhelpful until the truce that seems to have been reached recently. Overall, significant as China is in Australian foreign policy and preoccupying as it has often been for Australia's external policy practitioners day by day, it has not reshaped Australian foreign policy. The focus on Australia's Asian interests has certainly increased since the 1980s, but this has been genuinely regional and not specifically China-driven. The principal remit for Australian foreign policy has in effect been to keep the ship steady while the economic relationship grew. For most of the time since the Chinese abandoned their reservist policies in the early 70s, the prevailing view among Australia's strategic thinkers and defence planners has been that China's military development has been essentially defensive in character and related to Taiwan, and that as China's economic growth continued, then so would its strategic weight and influence in Asia. It has always been expected that China, almost as a matter of entitlement, would modernise its military capabilities as it got richer. Implicit also has been the view that, with the possible exception of any alliance considerations that might arise if the United States became involved in the defence of Taiwan, developments in Northeast Asia were beyond the reach of Australia's defence force. This consensus was reflected in a succession of defence planning documents after 1960, with gathering emphasis on China's growing strategic weight. In response to this, Australia's defence leaders began in the mid-90s to try to engage their Chinese counterparts through high-level visits both ways. Then in late 2008, Prime Minister Rudd spoke out about the increasing pace of military modernisation in Asia and its implications for Australia in terms which were assumed to mean he was referring to China. And in 2009, in anticipation of a new defence white paper, media interest in China-related security issues suddenly burgeoned. The white paper, when it appeared in May, reflected a change in tone from its predecessors. The Australian Defence Force's primary operational environment was still defined as ending at the equator, but Australia was said to have a deep stake in the whole Asia-Pacific security environment, which was noted to be changing in significant ways. By 2030, it was said, China will be the strongest Asian military power by a considerable margin. Its military modernisation will be increasingly characterised by the development of power projection capabilities. The pace, scope and direction of China's military modernisation, it was said, have the potential to give its neighbours cause for concern if not carefully explained. If it is not carefully explained, there is likely to be a question in the minds of regional states about the long-term strategic development of China's force development plans, especially if those go beyond what would be required for the defence of Taiwan, in that quote. The white paper went on to canvass what it called the remote but plausible potential of confrontation between Australia and a major power adversary. It considered it conceivable that in the period to 2030 we might have to contend with major power adversaries operating in our approaches, in the most drastic circumstance as a consequence of a wider conflict in the Asia-Pacific region. It then foreshadowed the acquisition of capabilities, in particular a larger submarine fleet, which were seen to be responses to this sort of risk. It also proposed the intensification of the strategic dialogue with China. To sum up then the first part of this work, that's the history, purposeful, creative and very successful pursuit of economic interests, steady, pragmatic, occasionally creative foreign policy, and an approach to defence and security issues which, while comfortable for most of the period, has become more wary and seemingly begun to affect the thinking of Australia's defence planners. The net of all this is probably best reflected in an interesting tool developed recently by PricewaterhouseCoopers, Asia Link and the Melbourne University, which seeks to measure against a number of criteria the level of Australia's engagement with countries in Asia. I'll try to explain the index later if anyone's interested, but according to it, since the chosen base year, 1990, quote, Australia's engagement with Asia has multiplied 4 times, that with the rest of the world 3 times, and that with China an astonishing 16 times. China comes out as the country in Asia with which Australia is most engaged, having long since overtaken Japan. The index, though, offers no measure of the sorts of concerns now implied in the Defence White Paper. This, then, is the challenge to Australia's policymakers, how to develop policies which serve both the country's economic interests and its security interests in the new world which is emerging from the rise of China. This will be a world different from the one which has been so kind to Australia over the last 60 years, a world in which China is a significantly bigger player. Put most simply, Australia must manage its national interests in a situation in which, firstly, China, the world's second most important economic power, the most dynamic force in the region in which Australia's interests are most engaged, and a significant underpinning of Australia's economy, is not a member of the same security alliance network as Australia, and secondly, in which the strategic balance which has served Australia's interests so well in the Asia-Pacific region is changing. The preeminence or dominance of the United States over the last 60 years in the Pacific has been an embedded part of Australia's strategic posture, one of the foundations on which its defence and security planning have been built. But the United States will remain the single strongest, while the United States will remain the single strongest power in the Pacific, the margin between it and the next power, China, is diminishing, and influence in the region will increasingly have to be shared. In this situation, Australia's neighbours will hedge more towards China, listen to it more, and trim their policies to reflect China's interests and concerns. They will also come to judge Australia in part on how well it gets on with China. Some might ask whether these challenges together will pose existential questions for Australia. Existential, that is, in the sense of questioning the basic precepts about the United States' dominance and power in the Pacific, on which Australia has anchored itself since World War II, and questioning the clear priority that attaches to the United States in Australian policy. The answer, in short, in my view, is that no sea change in Australia's international posture is required. The rise of China and of Asia as a whole is reshaping Australia's international environment and is challenging Australian policy to be responsive and to adapt to a new set of dynamics. But this can be managed without any fundamental reorientation of Australian policy. Whether or not UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown was correct when he said at the G20 summit in April that the Washington consensus is dead, there is no Beijing consensus either extant or in prospect to replace it. There are still too many questions about China's future for anyone to sensibly place national bets on it. And even if there were a Beijing consensus which had proofed a different economic model and ways of governing and doing business, Australia could not readily accommodate it. For all that Australia is deeply engaged with Asia, it has an identity which is distinctive and predominantly Western, and an economy with deep roots in the United States and Europe as well as Asia. Western political and business values and approaches are well rooted in Australia and are among the elements that make Australia attractive to Asian business communities, students, tourists and immigrants. The country will change as sources of immigration continue to shift towards Asia, but the core of Australia's culture will survive more or less as it is. Further, Australia is not naked in this debate. It has the world's 15th largest economy, its 11th or 12th largest defence budget. It has enormous reserves of natural resources and energy, including 30% of the world's uranium, and as Paul Keating used to say, it has a continent of its own. As a result, the Australia-China relationship is not as asymmetrical as some observers in Australia even suggest. It may be that in economic terms China is more important to Australia than Australia is to China, but in the world of interdependent trading relationships, Australia is China's 7th largest source of imports and a key source of resources and energy, and its 15th largest market, does not come to the table empty-handed. And finally, of course, Australia is not alone in facing the challenges of a changing order in the Asia-Pacific region. China is a major economic partner, the biggest or nearly so of most other countries in the American security network, including the United States itself. So where to from here? If a sea change is not needed, what policies are needed for Australia to respond to the emerging Asia-Pacific order? This is an order which will embrace not one but two major powers and indeed several other significant and still rising powers. The overriding requirement is for global and regional settings which embrace all powers and avoid the need for choices between them. Policy to support this grand objective will exist at several levels. At the highest global level, the world which best suits Australia's interests will be an open world, a world of inclusive networks rather than exclusive blocks. An open global trading regime is essential to Australia's wider international economic interests, including and indeed especially in relation to China, and has long been central to Australia's diplomatic advocacy. But the need for an open world order is not limited to trading regimes. There is as well a need to ensure against the emergence of anything suggestive of containment, and to make sure that all major powers, especially China, are folded into the international community. Beyond this, there is a need to define the regional settings that best suit Australia's interests. Clearly, an Asia-Pacific region, one which includes the United States as well as Australia and the countries of Asia, is central to this. The United States, as the dominant world power for 20 years, has played a significant part in the evolution of this region. With the rise of China, American dominance of the region, as we've said, will be less complete, but United States interests will remain considerable. Australia's calculation is that it will not be in Washington's interest to vacate the region, and that it will certainly not do that, nor would many, if any, countries wish it to do so. While many have in fact been agnostic about America's dominance, few, if any, would want to see an Asia-Pacific region in which the United States was not present in at least a balancing role. Hassan Wirajuda, the Indonesian foreign minister, made this point neatly in a recent address here in Washington. It's not now possible, he said, for any one power to dominate Asia. He then went on to say that while there had been some who wanted the East Asian summit to be confined to the ASEAN 10 plus China, Japan and Korea, Indonesia, he said, had argued for the inclusion of India and Australia and New Zealand. And he made clear his hope, which incidentally I would share, that the United States will join the EAS too. What's suggested in this is a new balance of power, in the sense that Hedley Bull, a distinguished Australian strategist of earlier times, used the term. That is, a situation which preserves the independence of sovereign states from the danger of domination. Here, of course, is the rub. Can the United States adjust to a world, or at least a region, in which the power which was once its exclusively is now shared with at least one other power, in which its role becomes one of balancer rather than one of primacy? And can China, the potential alternative power, accept that it too, for all its success and growing influence, will at best be able to share power in its own region? Among scholars, the historical determinists would say that in this situation, either a rising power will ultimately challenge the extant power, or an extant power will try to deny space to a new power. In this perception, conflict is inevitable either way. This is not the occasion to argue against the inevitability of this disastrous scenario. Others have done that elsewhere. Suffice to say here that the avoidance of conflict of this kind should not be taken for granted. The risks of it certainly have to be mitigated. Muscling up, in a military sense, might be part of this mitigation. Some countries are doing that, but not all. Indeed, when you look at expenditure patterns around Asia, fewer are doing that than you might expect. But for those which are taking this approach, it is a costly response, and for none is it a sufficient response in itself to the new world. Clear policies and hard implementation work are needed too. Critically, policies directed to regional integration and to establishing an agreed view of regional relationships are needed. True scholars of strategy will argue about whether the need is for a balance of power model or a concert of powers model. But in my view, with hard work, the Asia-Pacific region can be evolved in its own way with an amalgam of each. This is a sort of approach that drove Australia's advocacy of Asia-Pacific regionalism during the early 1990s and is now being revived. Not all the ideas and blueprints advanced to date have worked or are likely to be workable, but the endeavour must be persisted with, bearing in mind always that structures matter less than effective diplomacy in their use. In all this, the relationship between the United States and China is critical to the region and to Australia in particular. There was a period in the 90s in which policy in both Beijing and Washington seemed at times to we curbside bystanders to be driven by events relating to Taiwan, but the relationship has in fact been managed well by both sides over the last decade. If, as seems the case, some sort of China-Taiwan rapprochement is in prospect and Washington remains comfortable with that, that will remove one very significant flashpoint in the relationship. Still, as the two most influential powers in the Asia-Pacific region and potentially more widely, the need for strategic-level communication between the US and China exists across every international issue. This must be underpinned by an all-cards-on-the-table bilateral dialogue. Trade policy will loom large in this, but fundamental to it must be a bilateral agreement on arms control which embraces nuclear, missile and space warfare capabilities. Without understandings in these areas, strategic competition is likely to be not only high cost but high risk as well. The network of US alliances and alliance-like relationships in the Asia-Pacific has in fact been a key element in sustaining America's strategic presence in the region, and there is no reason why, in the framework I'm arguing for here, it should be diminished. An element in Australian policy should be to keep the ANZUS alliance dynamic and relevant, and at the same time to encourage Washington and other alliance capitals, including Tokyo and Seoul, to do the same. This does not mean, though, extending the format or the content of the alliance relationships. China is not the enemy, and America's alliance network does not need to be postured as though it is, but it does need to remain current, and America's extended deterrence policies need to remain both current and credible. Beyond this group, Australia, while maintaining its traditional focus on Indonesia, will have to continue to broaden and deepen its relationships with other countries in the region, especially India and Vietnam, understanding always that important as these players will be in the new regional order, they are not countries that will readily be seconded to the agendas of others. Australia's bilateral relationships with the two central players in this narrative, China and the United States, will of course remain critical. It's difficult to envisage a relationship more intense than that which Australia already has with the United States, but nothing in it should be taken for granted, least of all the need for continuing close and professional management of it. With China, there will always be more to be done. The requirement there for Australia will be for deeper engagement across all levels of government and community. It's pie in the sky to imagine that the level of intimacy which Australia has with the United States could ever exist with China, but it should be the benchmark. It would, of course, require a degree of openness on the Chinese side which is not yet in sight, but also require a very much greater level of China literacy among Australians, and that at least is something to which we can reasonably aspire. If all of this sounds like a strategy for walking both sides of the street or tilling two furrows simultaneously, then it is. This sort of strategy is neither new in diplomacy generally nor for Australia in particular. Walking both sides of the street does, however, impose certain requirements. The first is the need to have a clear understanding of the national interests at stake on each side of the street. The second is the need to avoid duplicity or any appearance of it, and to ensure as far as possible that policies in one area are not in tension with policies in other areas. The third is the need to ensure maximum application to each relationship. And finally, perhaps above all, there is a need for a coherent framework of the kind I'm seeking to describe, in which all the elements of Australia's global, regional and bilateral policies and its domestic policy decision-making fit together as one. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for the water.
Thank you, Rick, and I think all of you have seen now one reason why we have so enjoyed having Rick here. I should have introduced Jan Smith, Rick's spouse, and as he'd be the first to say, his better half. Jan, we've enjoyed getting to know you these past months as well. Let's open it up to people in the audience now. I think we have a microphone here. Is Sue? Sue, I don't see you. Bryce, you're going to do it? Okay. Since we are webcasting this, we need to have you speak into the microphone. We'll start right here in the middle with Bronson. If you will introduce yourself and keep your remarks brief.
Yeah, I'm Bronson Percival. I'm at CNA, and I also teach at SAIS. I'm interested in Australia's attitude towards the American adjustment of its strategic relationships. For example, the U.S.-India partnership. The impression, at least amongst some of us, was that when there was talk about expanding the trilab between Japan, Australia, and the U.S., that to include India, that Australia nixed that. In Southeast Asia, there's certainly the perception that the two countries that have the gumption to stand up to China are Vietnam and Indonesia. Now the United States is moving towards a much closer relationship with Indonesia. What's Australia's attitude likely to be as this U.S.-Indonesia comprehensive partnership evolves?
Thanks, Bronson. Well, broadly, in Australia, better, tighter U.S. relationships with any countries in Asia are welcome, except perhaps right at this moment North Korea. That's another matter. But in the case of India, that relationship was welcomed. We in Australia have struggled for years to establish the right kind of relationship with India. It's always been friendly enough, but lacking in some content. The US has great capacity to bring content to its relationship with India. The main point we make about that is don't assume anything about India in terms of alliance-like relationships. But I don't think that is assumed, so we welcome that. On the Quads, it is the case that the Australian Foreign Minister was the first to say publicly that we wouldn't be proceeding with that. But there are two points there. First, by that time, the Japanese had actually gone cold on it and didn't know how to withdraw, and the Indians were a bit uncertain about it. Secondly, the Australian government, which was the new government, the former government that led it into Quads, had been blindsided by the matter of by the fact that although the Australian government and others had said that the Quads were nothing to do with military arrangements, a month after the first informal gathering of the Quads, the four navies plus the Navy in Singapore held an exercise in the Bay of Bengal, which led the Chinese and some people in Australia to say, what the? And so I think the new government in Australia felt it was prudent to step back from it. If I'd been around and advising and quick enough on my feet, I would have said, don't announce this stepping back while standing alongside the Chinese foreign minister. That's where the minister was standing, and that's the day he got the question. So that's what he said. On the US-Indonesia relationship, we really welcome that very much. I think that's a very positive development from our point of view. Of course, made easier by the fact that Indonesia has transitioned very nicely to where it has as a democracy, that the military for the present is nicely contained, and that makes it a lot easier for the United States to deal, plus the President's own interests and so on. That's very welcome indeed.
Let's go in the back first, and then I'll eventually head up here.
Thank you. I'm Peter Botellier at Hopkins SAIS.
Yeah, Peter, how are you?
Nice to see you, Rick.
Hey, great.
12 years ago.
Yeah.
You mentioned almost in passing the decision by Rio's board to drop the Chinalco offer. I wonder if you'd come back to that and elaborate a bit on the background to it. My understanding of Chinalco's interest in Rio was in part to avoid a BHP Rio link-up, which would nicely lock up a large part of the global iron ore supply market. The implications of Rio's board decisions are potentially very, very significant for raw material steel market, iron ore markets. What are your thoughts on it? And could you also comment on the idea that at some point it might become interesting for China and Australia to do large-scale share swaps between the raw material supplier and the raw material processors in China? That, I think, has not happened so far, but it's linked to the earlier question. Could you comment on that also?
Thanks, Peter. I really welcome that. I think it's a tremendously interesting subject, not only from Australia's point of view, but more widely. Yeah, my understanding is that the Chinalco proposal began, as you say, with the proposed BHP takeover of Rio, when, as I understand it, the Chinese SOEs agreed that Chinalco would be their champion to try to head off this cartelisation. It's amazing how prone these resource industries are to cartelisation. I mean, BHP and Rio made a very persuasive case that the product would actually be a lot cheaper to China as a result of them sharing facilities, etc. But that argument was suspect for the Chinese. Chinalco became the champion, and in 2008 bought 9.6%, I think it was, of Rio, which helped them through the debt problem temporarily, but then with the economic downturn, the fall in prices of raw materials, BHP withdrew its bid for Rio. Rio was still left with a massive debt, having taken over Allcan at the top dollar price a couple of years earlier, and that's when it was vulnerable to the bid from the Chinese side that would have given them 19.6% and potentially up to 2 board members. More importantly, the deal was structured, as I understand it, in such a way that Chinalco would have had a disproportionate authority within some of the key aspects. It wouldn't have been, in other words, 19.6% of control across the board. It would have been higher in some areas and lower in others. A very complicated deal. Now, right from the outset, a number of Rio shareholders questioned it, as you know, mainly in London, where most of them are anyway, and along the way, of course, a chairman and a CEO fell. The Australian Foreign Investment Review Board had to consider this proposal. It has 90 days in which to consider it from the point at which the proposers pressed the button, as it were. They pressed that in March. The deal, I think the Foreign Investment Review Board had to recommend to government, which had to make a decision by the 15th of June, yesterday. Then 10 days ago, as I said, the Rio board withdrew the proposal in favour of a rights issue in the UK and a sale of some equity to BHP. Chinese reaction had been very interesting. In the case of Chinalco and its leadership, they have been very critical of Rio and used this very colourful language about, a fiance being jilted and all that sort of stuff, and how they went there with open hands and this deal was done behind their back and so on. But they have also said, very interestingly, that they have learned something in commercial terms about the nature of investment which is likely to be acceptable overseas. That is, they have to structure their bids and their search for equity in more, let's say, subtle ways. And I thought that was a very interesting statement that they'd made. More popularly in China, there's some response against the Australian government, as I've read it, along the lines that, a big company like that wouldn't have made that decision and that the Australian government was behind it all and so on. I don't actually think that's the case. I think, firstly, the Australian government probably welcomed the Rio board taking that decision and saving it from a hard decision. But I think the Australian government's decision would have been probably to accept the deal subject to substantial conditions, or to send it back and suggest that it be restructured according to conditions. But I think they would have accepted it in the end. Now, I'm not employee of the government, and I haven't spoken to anyone in the FIRB since about last January or February, so I don't know where they got to, but I think that's where they got to. Bear in mind these things. Australia has always had a huge intake of foreign investment. United States, UK, of course, Germany, Japan, and we are accustomed to that. Secondly, we have a very strong regime for foreign investment management, transfer pricing deal arrangements, competitive competition assurance arrangements, as well as the FIRB itself. And thirdly, most importantly perhaps, all of these proposals that have reached Australia from China have been importuned by the Australian companies, or UK Australian company in Rio's case. It's not as though the Chinese have come and tried to stick this down Australian throats. Australian companies have been desperate for cash, and they've gone out and gone to China because that's where the money is and that's where their customers are. I think finally that it's a pity that this whole issue of Chinese investment and its rapid spike came to a head around a deal which, in the view of many commentators, was commercially flawed at the outset. I think that muddied the waters because it was such an aggressive bid in its way for Rio, for that part of Rio. So those who were standing in the wings ready to get into this issue in a negative way, had some ready-made arguments. There was some political opposition to it in Australia from the Country Party people in particular, and from an independent senator and some of the press commentary. Most of the economic commentary, though, was supportive of the investment but questioning of its commercial efficacy or commercial sense. It's a long and complicated story, but it's fascinating, and it remains now to see what Chinese will do. If what Xiong has said about learning from this deal and restructuring things better, if that's to be taken at face value, I think it's a good thing. If they draw some political conclusions, then I think that's a pity. On the other hand, they are committed to equity investments overseas now rather than just investments in bonds, and I think we'll see more of it. Meanwhile, as that's gone on, as I said, Chinese investment anyway has grown by 40 billion or sixfold, even if the Rio deal hasn't gone through. Long answer, but a very interesting subject. Make a great book, a terrific book for one of those journalists who writes these things really quickly.
Anyone else? Okay, right here. Bryce, right in front of you. That's right. Yeah.
Tak Oka.
Use your mic, thanks.
Oka is my name. I used to be a journalist, and I wondered if you would compare what the relationship between the commercial relationship between China, or I should say the economic, China and Australia now, with with Japan in, say, in the 70s, when there was a continuous line of ore carriers and coal carriers from Japan, making the trip to Australia. What are the differences and similarities?
Thanks, Oka-san. I think that is a very interesting question, because in reflecting on this work, I thought often of those periods in the 70s and 80s when Chalmers Johnson and everyone was postulating the same kinds of issues in relation to Japan as you so often hear now in relation to China. Just on Japan, the Australian trade with Japan, of course, continues to boom along. All carriers, LNG, all the rest of it, and without this great spurt in China trade related to LNG, uranium and so on, Japan would still be Australia's biggest trading partner, and as I said, there's about $60 billion worth of Japanese investment in Australia, which, if you'd stood there in 1980 and looked forward, you might have expected that to have been higher by now, but it is still substantial. What is different, I guess, goes partly to this question that I've been wrestling with. The perception of China and China's growth and where it leads to is different from that of Japan, I think. Maybe not different for the sort of Chalmers-Johnson school, but for mainstream thinking. I don't think that China's rise, perhaps I'm not quite right. I'm just going to say I don't think it attracted quite as much commentary in a defence sense as Japan's did, but it did for a while, didn't it? It's a very interesting comparative. It is used positively, this analogy, in Australia. People say, well, why are you so agitated about China? Look where we were with Japan 30 years ago and look how well that's all worked out. So, we can cope with this.
Okay, let's go to the back of the room and then we'll...
Just to finish, there are some significant differences, though, and one of them is students and immigration from China, which we didn't have from Japan. That's a layer, gives a personal kind of quality to this relationship, which makes it different from the Japanese one.
Right in front of Peter. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Callie Curie from the Project 2049 Institute. You've kind of alluded to and danced around the values issue, if you will, of the difference. If you look, for instance, at the Japan-China comparison, the difference is Japan's democracy. There are shared values there.
Yeah.
Also with the United States and other countries. Can you be a little bit more explicit in addressing that issue?
Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. I actually had a couple of paragraphs in here on that, which I took out because I thought you'd find it hard enough to endure what I had. But you get an opportunity to try to recall them. What I've said was a few things. One is, historically, including in relation to China, but other places as well, Australian governments have taken a much more, shall we say, pragmatic view on issues of human rights and democracy than US governments have. And that will ever be so. We're a much smaller power, and our stake in the countries of concern, let's put it that way, is proportionately very much greater. As well, we are not a country which has ever proselytised any particular view. We, as I say, essentially are pragmatic tradesmen in this world. But so what I had talked about here was another challenge for Australia, and it is this: China's destiny is quite unclear. We don't know where it's heading. It's a work in progress as a political entity. But we can be quite sure of this: where it ends up, where it gets to, it won't be anything like a Western democracy of even the most ersatz Japanese kind. It'll be a very different place still. And it will be our major trading and potentially economic partner. So we're faced with the need for a pragmatic and working relationship with that entity at a time when our other great significant part, the United States, is likely to be more sensitive to, critical of, the kind of China that we're dealing with than we are, which introduces another level of difference between us and the US, which has been evident on other occasions. But I make no bones about it. The Australian approach, if I'm not mistaken, will be essentially pragmatic. We have not fallen out. We've had differences on this with the US in the past, and there's a potential for them to become starker depending on how strongly the US feels about what I think is going to be the direction China continues to take. Did you want to respond to that? Does that surprise you at all?
No, it doesn't surprise. It disappoints, but doesn't surprise. Just to ask how...
Kelly, let Bryce bring the mic. No, let Bryce bring the microphone to you.
Just to follow up and say, how does that play back home, I guess, is the other question I would ask.
Again, there are constituencies in Australia which advocate more robust approaches to human rights and democracy and so on, but they're not built into our political culture in the way that they are in the United States. This is a question that goes very much at the heart of Australia, the differences between Australia and the United States. To put it most crudely, and I hope not offensively, there's no sense of exceptionalism about Australia. We were not created, we're not founded by idealists, we were founded by refugees and criminals.
So were we.
Well, in our case, the real criminals were the ones who stayed at home, and they're still there. But no, it's quite a different outlook on the world. Plus, a much smaller power in a different part of the world just shapes a quite different outlook. So we, have a great preoccupation with human rights and democracy and the way it works in Australia. We do what's necessary overseas, but and that varies a bit from one kind of government to another, but we don't go out quite as far as the United States.
Let's head over there. One in the back of the room, and then we'll come down here.
I'm senior editor Alex Chung from Voice of America. I have a question to ask you. Right now, there's two theories. One is anti-access theory versus shore access theory. This is one United States versus Chinese. And the Chinese also always stress on the EEZ. How is the Australian position toward this?
Towards the EEZ?
To the EEZ and this different strategic view. China's anti-access, the concept. United States assured access, in terms of freedom of navigation.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Alex, I'm qualified to comment on that. I'm not a spokesman for the government, of course. I'm not sure that I get to grips with that principle.
So which means your comment on the freedom of navigation is the primary interest of the United States.
Freedom of navigation is very critical to Australia. We're a trading nation, of course, I've forgotten what the percentage of our GDP is that derives from foreign trade, but it's very high, among the highest in the world. And we're a highly globalized country in every other way, so freedom of access, both in terms of freedom of navigation and every other form of access, is at the soul of our existence. And in the law of the sea negotiations going back all these 40 years, or whatever they've been running, we've been quite strong on that. We have, however, signed and ratified the Law of the Sea Convention as it is, and are prepared to work with what it's got.
How about EEZ? China's EEZ come down.
I don't think we've got anything in mind that recognises that. Is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know where
economic zone.
I don't know where the Australian government stands on China's EEZ. I know the issues as it extends into the South China Sea and so on, but I don't know what the Australian government's position now is, as I've not been in government for some years.
Eric.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. There was a lot of talk of a Northeast Asian security arrangement. It's lost momentum now. Six-party talks have not gone. Maybe it never had momentum. But I wonder if what Australia's views on that were. Were you encouraging it? Did you want to influence its shaping? Would you have wanted to be a member, or is that just north of the equator and not interested? And the harder part of the question, if it's not a formal security arrangement, but now we treat China as an insider rather than an outsider, is Australia satisfied with its role? How does it feel when terms like the G2 come up and so forth? Is Australia content with the security arrangement in its ad hoc form?
Thanks, Eric. Well, they're questions that go a bit to what I've been reflecting on here. I think the talk of the is interesting. It seems to me this reference to the six-party talks as a possible model has gone through several iterations. When the six-party talks first began, this thing came up, then it went away, then the six-party talks seemed to be succeeding, the Chinese were well engaged, so maybe it would be a model. I personally have long been of the view that it's a great crisis management model. with limited success so far, but it's working. It's better than nothing at all. But I don't believe that has wider application, other than in the sense that it grows the habit of those countries working together. If I should say, as a footnote, that if there were any kind of formal arrangement, I can be sure that the Australian government of any kind would want to be in. Any club that's formed, we want to be in. That's one of the rules of our existence. The African Union, we sort of draw the line at, a pretty costly membership. But no, we would want to be. But I think perhaps more important is the notion of this, the six-party talk growing a habit of working together, dealing with each other, because I think the future probably lies less in structured organisations and arrangements than in effective networks. And those effective networks, they can grow out of things like Six Power or any of the other arrangements, and they constitute this sort of concert of powers, this understanding between powers of where things are. Arguably, a kind of concert of powers, understood, but never spelled out explicitly, grew out of the China-US rapprochement of 1972, a clear understanding about where the lines were drawn in relation to Taiwan, and a clear understanding about the double reassurance that the US gave to China about Japan, and that the US gave to Japan about China. Now, that was a kind of concert, an understanding that stood up for 30-odd years. And I think that sort of arrangement is likely to be redrawn, not an arrangement, that sort of sets of relationships is likely to be redrawn through processes like Six Power, Six Party. Has a complicated answer, but I've become wary of talking about architecture for two reasons. One, I think networks matter more, and the architecture can provide them. But secondly, the problem with architecture is it becomes an end in itself, and it's actually effective diplomacy that matters, not the architecture and who's in it. On the G2, I don't know what the Australian government's view of that is, but my view is that it goes right to the heart of what I'm talking about here. Two very strong powers of a very different kind, that we've got to deal with both of. It's quite a challenging notion. I think the Chinese have sort of disowned the idea of G2, and they don't like being pushed forward quite that way. Equally, I've heard someone here in the US say it would be very good for the US to be put head-to-head in competition that might lead to some discipline here. So all of these things are interesting, but I didn't hear any great reaction in Australia about the G2. Maybe people who are very taken with China's rise would say, yeah, that's where it's got to, not surprisingly. Others, like me, would say, not quite there yet.
Okay, I see a hand. I can't see who it is. There it is. And then we'll come over here.
Hi, Raj Srinivasan, a management consultant. Question on how you feel the presence of the large Chinese diaspora settled in Australia. How has that affected Australia's policy towards China? And particularly, I'm intrigued, do you think that on the values front, Australia has perhaps moved closer towards China as a result of the Chinese population settled in Australia?
Very interesting question, Rod. I think, firstly, the Chinese diaspora in Australia is a very diverse one. As you'd understand, it embraces Chinese communities that have come from all over the world, initially actually from California. And they were among the first Chinese settlers in Australia. And then, of course, from many parts of Southeast Asia, and especially from Indonesia and Vietnam. And they are people with a very wary view of Beijing. I think that then many from Taiwan, and more indeed from Hong Kong, many Chinese, and again they have a different view of what we used to call the mainland. So I don't think there's a sort of uniform view of that. That said, I think that the mainland China, the China community is growing, perhaps more rapidly than the others. I think there have been some issues in business dealings between them and their companies in China, which have excited the law a couple of times and led people to raise these questions that you are raising about the effect of that community on values in Australia. I think that the weight of existing culture and rule of law will in fact shape those immigrants, as it has immigrants from many other countries in Australia. After all, one in 4 Australians were either not born in Australia or who had parents who were not. And so far we've succeeded in shaping all of those mixed communities in our likeness. And I think in time that is what happens to immigrant communities. The first generation tends to be more adventurous. The second settles into what I'll call our pattern. And I think that's what's happening with Chinese.
We're here.
Thanks, Rick. My name's John Barnett. I work at Melbourne University. I just want to say that's an excellent presentation and well worth travelling to Washington for, although possibly not worth the jet lag. But,
I'm sorry I missed what you were doing on the environment and the Murray River. Have we fixed it?
I had that leak in the first 5 minutes. I'd solved global climate change within 20.
Yeah,
a comment I think about this thing about the diaspora, and I'll try not to go into some personal reflection here, but it's really striking the extent to which when you work in a university, the relationships between Chinese and Australian students. I mean, I think we really get China. I mean, admittedly, I live in Melbourne, which is a more Asian city, and that 2020, 2030...
Also the world's second biggest Greek city.
Yes, that's right, but the Chinese food is much better. Much less likely to get food poisoning too, I might add. Well, 2020, 2030, I think that the generation of decision makers about the relationship between Australia and China is going to be quite different to the generation today. And I think that notion of difference that is still slightly there will almost not be there at all, and I think that's going to be a really significant factor. Can I fly a kite briefly? I've just come from Fiji, and it's a country I know very well, and I think from Australia's foreign policy perspective, we're going to have a looming problem there. That's becoming an increasingly autocratic regime.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can solve that problem on our own, but I think with the support of a powerful ally, we could potentially do something. And my initial thought was, with someone from the State Department turning up in Fiji with a bag full of cash for a military restructuring program and a democratic strengthening program could make a big difference. We couldn't do that. But could we entice China to do that? And what would be the significance of that in terms of the Chinese-Australian-American relationship in the Pacific? Would China do it? Would we want to do it? I'm just flying a kite here about how we, if we have two powerful allies in the region, can we not also begin to use China in the way that we might want to use the US in our relationship with our unstable neighbours?
I think the short answer is that we're unlikely to encourage China to play that kind of a role. There's been plenty of Chinese money washing around the Pacific over the last few years, Chinese and Taiwanese, much of it in pursuit of votes and members of parliament and so on. And happily, as I suggested here, there might be some truce in that little game. But nevertheless, there's enough, I think, bad Chinese money in crook business deals and that sort of thing going through there that would make us wary of that. And I don't think we're in the business of encouraging, Chinese military involvement, even through training in the region. I think, if I thought the solution you're offering of someone from the State Department turning up with a bag of money and sorting it out was a goer, I might support that too. But, in a funny way, no, I'm not going to say this because we're on the record, but...
go ahead. We won't tell.
When you want to affect, as the Chinese are finding in relation to North Korea, when you contemplate regime change, you have to be very careful what you wish for. And the complete collapse of the state would be sort of less in our interests than the faltering state that we have now. I agree with you. It's a huge problem. And looking from the outside, people are probably saying, as they are of China in relation to North Korea, the Australians have got all these levers, why don't they pull them? But you pull and nothing happens. They just go on, and it gets very frustrating, and you don't pull hard enough to pull a regime down, because that's not what you want to actually do, to pull a state down, because that's not what you want to do.
David, I think I saw your hand up in the corner here. And this, unfortunately, will have to be the last question, though I see many of you still have your hands up. I'm sorry for that.
I could share it with my neighbor here. Rick, David
Hi,
Shambog.
Yeah, hi.
From Georgia. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring you back to the military strategic domain. You raised the white paper and the way China's military modernization was depicted in that. But I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on the sort of spectrum of views and debates within the Australian strategic studies community that underlay not just the white paper's content, but the discussions about the PLA. I mean, we saw in the white paper what I might call the hedger balancer school. But are there other schools of thought about China? And what is, particularly given your former position, Secretary, what's the nature of Australia's military engagement with the PLA, and what's the strategy behind it?
On the second of those issues, I mean, we have had a defence attaché there since 1982. I think that it was a pretty slow-moving job until the 90s, when this whole issue of China's growing strategic weight, etc., and the greater spending on the PLA emerged. And at that time, our defence leadership, uniformed people particularly, sought to engage China very substantially. They've done lots and lots of visits, and they have meetings, and they did higher and higher in level, and they're called more and more strategic. But I don't know, frankly, whether we actually get any more out of them than anybody else ever does. That said, I mean, it's been a worthwhile engagement. You always learn something, and the Chinese always learn something. I always used to say to Chinese generals when they returned, what was it that interested you most about Australia? Or what did you learn that you didn't expect to learn? And their answers were, fascinating. Like, it seemed to one of them that the NCOs were in charge. Beautiful. And, sure enough, they've gone and created an NCO corps. But no, that engagement goes on, and the objective is to try to understand what the Chinese are getting to try to socialise them, as we used to say, to what the world thinks about them and what they need to do to address those concerns if they're concerned about them. It's that kind of a dialogue. On the military side, I think the capabilities that have attracted most interest in Australia are the sort of leapfrogging capabilities that I'll call them, that is in relation to submarines and cyber capabilities and missilery. They're the ones that have attracted most commentary in Australia. As to the Australian strategic community, well, naturally, most of the people in that are former military people, and they tend to take a fairly hard overview of it. The commentary that attracted most attention prior to the white paper, and that you may be alluding to, is that by my very good friend Hugh White, who wrote a very, very sophisticated paper. And as I've said to Hugh, the problem is that his paper was too sophisticated. What he actually said is that China is not a threat, and he can't see it becoming one. But, he said, put it in very crude terms, and it's a bit too complicated to fairly summarise it, but what he was saying was China is changing the regional order. If we're going to be able to play in that order effectively, we have to muscle up a bit ourselves. The problem with that, as I say, is it's quite hard to explain it in newspapers and television ads, presentations, and it became the China threat scenario, and Hugh was seen as the proponent of it, but it isn't actually what he was saying. He was saying we need to up muscle in order to hold our place in this region, And in a kind of a way, I think the white paper does that, but not quite as starkly as Hugh would have had it. I think he wanted 30 submarines and 2 JSFs, 200 JSFs, and we've settled for 12 and 100 if they're going to be affordable. But that was the shape of the debate. I don't think anyone in the strategic community was saying we should not take notice of China. We can afford to ignore that. I think the people who hold that view more are more likely to be in the economic community, which goes to the heart of the issue I'm trying to resolve here.
Well, very stimulating. We could go on for a great deal longer, but I think we probably ought to let people adjourn. Join me, if you will, in expressing our appreciation to Rick.